Hello, it is, well, 10:30 Sunday, and we are going to be continuing our exploration of 3D Workers Island. This is God willing the last installment of this exploration of this read through, if you will. As I have continually alluded to, we I'm working on a much longer analysis that is going to be more formally presented and won't have uh, all my slurping and coughing sounds and unseemly breathing and all of these noises. So I apologize for that, but this is just supposed to be an informal read through and maybe just a way to give you some insight into my thought process when I make my analysis videos. Um, there's going to be a great deal of speculation and observation that I make in these read throughs that aren't going to end up in the analysis video. But conversely, there's going to be a lot of things I say in the analysis video that don't that I'm not really mentioning here either, because there are so many different threads you can pull on with this work. Um, yeah, I mean, this guy continually makes things that are very layered, very thought provoking. Um, they have a certain ambiguous quality to them, which is it can be divisive. I'm a fan of it. Um, and is that enough? Is that enough of a prelude for what is to come here? Where we last left off, um, we were inspecting the sad case of Thomas. Uh, Thomas is seems like he's going through it. He's not having a good time, and um, we talked a little bit about the meta commentary angle here. Um, but I will say also, this seems to me like something that we can properly characterize as the quote unquote heart of the work, if you will. I think that is appropriate to say. Um, let's just kind of emphasize this part. I talked about it quite a bit in the last video, but it is quite important, I think. Um, Important with respect to the structure of the work as a whole and thematically important as well. So, um, Thomas asks, how many of them are sitting at the bottom of the ocean, alluding to these compressed balls that are said to have are said to be sort of the compressed form of a character known as Amber. So um, Thomas says, I just can't help but feel hopeless about everything. Nobody will ever help me, and I'll never help myself. I'm too afraid even to reach out. I'm not even writing this right now. This message exists only in my head. This whole website exists only in my head. 3D Workers Island? What is this? Would I really put this online? Would I really give anyone the slightest glimpse into my world? This is fake. This is all fake, and nobody will ever see it. So, um, we've talked about the meta commentary angle here. So you can go back to the previous video if you're confused as to what I'm referring to. Um, I will say, um, trying to contextualize this in in the uh, trying to contextualize this with respect to the narrative is tricky. But in my view, it's it's strongly insinuated that Thomas is the creator of the screensaver, perhaps. Um, and then, of course, from this meta commentary standpoint, Thomas then functions as a sort of analog for the creator of the work as a whole, right? Um, intentional fallacy uh, notwithstanding. So um, that is kind of what I think is going on here, if I had to guess. Um, and so I think the thing I would like to emphasize at this point is there seems to be a great deal of guilt about this that is a little bit confounding. How many of them are sitting at the bottom of the ocean? This is what Thomas is wondering. Um, Almost kind of insinuating that perhaps Thomas is responsible, right? So that would make sense if Thomas was the creator of the screensaver. But then it sort of raises the question as to why. 3D Workers Island? What is this? Would I really put this online? Would I really give anyone the slightest glimpse into my world? Um, yeah, I don't know. Let's kind of sit with that. Let's let it percolate and see if it goes anywhere. Um, there is, of course, this whole website exists only in my head. So could be a reference to the website. Yeah, it's ambiguous. So I will explore this a bit further in my analysis video and try to make sense of it. Here's the next scene. We are on slide 272, so we are getting close to the end. I think there's a total of 300. So here we have Grace um, standing out here by herself, standing out on the beach, just kind of looking out. And that's all there is. And then we get this intermission. Now, this is quite interesting. So I'm just backing up here a little bit so this intermission kind of comes into play with Grace standing here alone. And we get what appears to be a series of multicolored balls that coalesce on a surface here. So we have purple, pink, yellow, green, orange, um, various colors. Yes, we have red here. I want you to keep this in mind because despite its apparent ambiguity, it it is, in my view, critically important with respect to the meaning of the work itself. Um, I will explain this further in my analysis video, but what I will say to get your brain, to get those cogs turning, um, consider this intermission uh, in the context of the so-called underlying worker concept that is alluded to previously. You see where I'm going with this? Maybe it would help to back up and kind of explain worker degeneration a little bit. So if you recall previously, we went through this this explanation of a phenomenon known as worker degeneration. Yes? Worker degeneration is something akin to injury or damage. This damage is associated with an active entity which 3D Whisker calls a worker, hence the name of this page. It's not clear to me how this term came about. It wasn't invented by 3D Whisker's authors, yet it implies a bit of knowledge about the screensaver's internals, that the injury is associated in some fundamental way with the underlying worker concept. This is especially strange since the only documented cases of worker degeneration are tied to one character, that being Amber. Therefore, it seems premature to generalize this term to such an extent, but I'll use the established name. Okay? Do you see uh, what the tension here? There is a tension between a sort of interpretive tension between with respect to this so-called underlying worker concept, um, and whether or not this phenomenon known as worker degeneration applies to just Amber, or if it applies more generally to the worker class. You see where I'm going with this? So, what is worker degeneration? Worker degeneration is this process by which Amber turns red and then undergoes a process of compression, see, in which she turns into a red ball. This red ball is seemingly inert. It doesn't move or interact with anything, but yes, the red ball is Amber. Okay? And then, so this is the process of worker degeneration. And then we have this narrator who seems on the fence about whether or not this process only applies to Amber or whether it is something that can be generalized with respect to the underlying worker concept. With respect to if we were to understand this in programming terms, assuming that these so-called workers are instantiations, assuming that the software was developed in a way that would have been conventional at the time, would have been in accordance with object-oriented programming, that sort of programming paradigm, then it would be fair to say that these so-called workers are instantiations of uh, a class of objects. And I'm not even I'm not ascribing this with any significance other than to say this is how the program would have been designed at this point in time. Um, the so-called workers would be instantiations of a class of objects. And so then it stands to reason that one of two things is happening here with respect to this worker degeneration. The first possibility is that worker degeneration, this process by which amber turns red and undergoes a process of compression and turns into a red ball, which people have observed apparently multiple times, this process is something that is unique about the worker known as Amber, something about this particular instantiation. Um, and so if you operate in accordance with this possibility, um, Amber would be some kind of aberrant individual uh, that is experiencing some kind of bug or something that is unique to Amber specifically. Are you following? The other possibility is that worker degeneration is tied to the so-called underlying worker concept and therefore is a class condition. I'm pausing here for a very dramatic silence because what do we see? So, what happens? Amber turns into a red ball, a sort of static, inert object that is devoid of any real quality, just red, just a flat red object. Um, and then what do we see? We see this intermission where we have a number of balls that are various colors. Hmm? Hmm. What do you suppose is happening here? I'll leave it up to you, dear viewer, as to what is happening. Is worker degeneration something that is tied specifically to amber, or is it a class condition? Is it something that is connected inextricably to the underlying worker concept? What do you think? Is it something that all workers on the island experience, or is it just amber? What do you think this intermission suggests? We let's just sit on that one for now, and then we can proceed. So, in this new act called Recession of the Islands, um, we see these inert red spheres sinking into the ocean. We got a wheelbarrow here, no characters. We pan further out into this vast oceanic abyss. This island is completely isolated. And then we get what appears to be a sort of depiction of many, many screens, um, which I interpret as sort of like, basically just telegraphing to the audience that multiple instances of this screensaver um, are being ran at any given time. And so this is kind of these individual squares here are representations of different instances where the same basic process is occurring. And then we get a flat red image, which is completely devoid of any, it's completely static. There is no gradient quality to it. It is just a completely flat red image. And that's the end. 3D Workers Island, a thing by Tony Domenico. So we got through it. Congratulations. We're 18 minutes in, and we have gone through the entire thing. A few things to index here. I will say I am a I'm a big fan of how this ends. I think it is very effective. Um, I think it is just the right amount of expository information and just the right amount of ambiguity. I know that is kind of that's kind of an individual preference, um, but as far as my sort of aesthetic sensibilities, this type of thing is right up my alley, and um, I'm I'm really happy that this thing exists. So, um, just wanted to say that. And I also would like to talk a little bit about various things that are going on here that I will expand upon in my analysis, but are perhaps things things that are not readily apparent based on maybe a cursory reading of this thing. Uh, and I'll continue referring to it as a thing because that seems to be Tony's preference. So let's call it a thing. It's a thing, like I do think that is very intentional, right? A thing by Tony Domenico. And so um, in some sense, the word thing implies that it defies some level of categorization. It defies some level of uh, genre conceits and is instead operating in a sort of liminal space between uh, various states. On one hand, it's kind of a slideshow. On the other hand, it's a short story. On the other hand, it's kind of a web comic. Um, on the other hand, it's like a sort of meta narrative. Um, it makes references to uh, makes sort of intertextual references to other things that Domenico has done, such as Good Sky. And um, yeah, if you want, at some point, maybe we can read through Good Sky and do an analysis of that. I think that might be a worthwhile endeavor. But for now, I guess it would suffice to say that that is one reference that is made. So the character Good Kid is seems to, I mean, that seems to be a reference because Good Kid has states in this work that they've contrived a skin disease uh, called Kutilakune. I'm just I I'm that's how I'm going to pronounce it. Uh, someone someone in the comments kind of elaborated on how it should be pronounced based on the fact that due to its Latin etymology, I suppose, but I'm not going to remember that shit. So I'm just calling it Kutilakune. And so that skin disease is referenced in Good Sky. We can take a closer look at that and see if there's any um, thematic parallels. I believe there are, but it's been a little while since I actually read that. So that might be a worthwhile endeavor. But um, some things to point out here, and I'm not exactly gonna remember all the slides, but um, some things to keep in mind, I think, are this character Good Kid is strongly insinuated to be, at the very least, one of the contributors to this website inside 3DWI. Um, so, and I'm looking for evidence to indicate that. So let's see here. Yeah, I don't, right, exactly. So we have the character Good Kid participating in the um, discovery pages forum. And then we get this description here of the PJR pin by a user named G Key. So that's interesting. Good Kid G Key. It and we know based on based on the way Good Kid has interacted in this forum, we know that perhaps they aren't the most reliable narrator. You know what I'm saying? Because they've already admitted that they will, that they just straight up make shit up. Um, like they've made up this fake skin disease, you know, and so it's kind of telegraphed that perhaps Good Kid is not exactly the most reliable narrator, but there's multiple ways of reading this, and I am not saying there is a correct interpretation of what's going on. It's more so that an ambiguity is baked into the work, just like Petscop. Um, and so it can be read in a variety of ways. For example, I think, you know, I'm just looking for this post by Good Kid. I'm trying to, here we go. So this is early on. This is slide 122. So we're still in the sort of like the first half of the story. Um, this happened back in October. In detention, they had me sit in the computer lab where I ostensibly wasn't allowed to play on the computers, LOL. But my computer lab teacher was in there upgrading Office, and I showed him 3DWI and explained it to him. I swear he was like enchanted by it. He wanted to install it on all the computers, so we installed it on all the computers together while eating donut holes. Someone Someone seems to think that the donut holes are significant. I have to go back and look at that comment, but I thought that was kind of funny. Um, we had some problems, and I had to call my sweet and angelic mommy to tell her why I was still at school, but we eventually got it working after 7 p.m. So there's a couple of strange things going on here. For number one, my sweet and angelic mommy uh, seems like an seems like an odd thing to say, right? So there's an insinuation that perhaps this person is Pat Lawler's kid, maybe, and they are trying to speak favorably of uh, speak favorably of Pat Lawler, so as to not like raise any red flags, or perhaps it's just kind of like she's being sardonic, my sweet and angelic mommy, you know. Um, Especially when you consider the fact that in the footer it says, "Forgive me, I don't know anything. I'm just a 14-year-old teenage kid." So this seems quite this seems questionable, right? Um, like kind of being cheeky, tongue in cheek. Yes. Um, we turned off the lights and started it going on every computer in the room. It was a powerful experience. Just all these different things happening, all these different things happening on the island all around us on glowing screens in the dark and silent computer lab at night. Way better than 3D pipes. It felt like this was the way 3DWI was meant to be experienced. I recommend putting this thing on as many screens as you possibly can, right? So it it does seem, and perhaps I pointed this out before, but it's worth repeating because it seems thematically important to me. Regardless, so first off, there's a dichotomy that emerges between Pat Lawler and Good Kid. Good Kid eventually gets banned for calling Pat Lawler a criminal. Pat Lawler is this forum administrator. They lay down the law. They are in charge of the forum. They censor things. They control the discourse, essentially, right? And from a charitable perspective for Pat Lawler, it seems as though if on paper her rationale is that she's trying to kind of um, ensure that uh, the conversation stays clean and sanitized so as not to spread falsehoods about the screensaver itself, right? Um, However, we have the renegade good kid who is sort of uh, telegraphed as um, a rebellious individual who wants to spread, um, perhaps wants to spread uh, an alternative narrative, if you will, something a bit more, uh, the possibility that something a bit more nefarious is occurring within the screensaver, right? Um, so you have this dichotomy that emerges between Pat Lawler and Good Kid. And it's interesting to note the similarities between the two, actually. While on paper they seem to be diametrically opposed to each other, they both are of the opinion I recommend putting this on as many screens as you possibly can. Isn't that interesting? When you consider and I'm going to try to find the textual evidence here, so bear with me, but like it's quite interesting um, that both of them seem to fully uh, fully kind of endorse the idea that you should install this screensaver and you should run it on as many systems as humanly possible. So they are, while while on paper they are diametrically opposed to each other ideologically. I'm using the term ideology loosely, right? Because they both have ideas about um, they both have theories and ideas about the screensaver and how it should be talked about. So I'm I think it's entirely reasonable to say that's sort of like an ideological set of presuppositions emerging with respect to the screensaver, right? So, um, and Pat Lawler here admits, or they suggest that they have it running on 5 different computers in their house, right? Um, and I can't find the specific post here, but I think you get the idea. Um, the, the idea being this, that uh, in either case, despite whatever their ideology is, the basic idea is that whatever you think, uh, this screensaver should be propagated as much as possible. Whether whether you are in the Pat Lawler school of thought, which is essentially that there's so many interesting novel things that um, can be observed, and therefore it makes sense to run it as much as possible. And there's also a kind of rhetorical justification or rhetorical it serves Pat Lawler rhetorically to say that she's running it on 5 systems, Because then she can say, with respect to these alternative theories that emerge, I've never seen anything of the sort. And I'm running it 24/7 on 5 different computers, right? And this is even um, this argument is put forth at some point in the story, right? So it serves Pat Lawler to say that she's running it on as many systems as possible, and she is um, observing as much as possible. Um, whereas the so-called amber shitheads, they they propagate the screensaver in order to collect evidence, right? In order to gather more and more creepy observances in order to support the idea that something nefarious is going on with respect to this screensaver, right? So in either case, their ideology supports propagating the system and running it as much as possible. And then you get these 2 different perspectives that nonetheless support the idea that you should run the screensaver as much as possible and observe it as much as possible and try to get other people to run it in order to continue propagating it like a virus, right? But then you get an alternative perspective from Thomas, which is this sort of rumination, right? This this is why it's it's thematically important, both in terms of the metatextual significance, but it's also important in terms of the story because it is a negation of both perspectives. You see what I'm getting at? It is a negation of both the amber shitheads in some sense, but it is also a negation of Pat Lawler's perspective as well. Because the question is, how many of them are sitting at the bottom of the ocean? That is not to say that there's a clear answer here. It's not to say that Thomas is in favor of shutting the screensaver down and never running it again, or disallowing it, or stopping it from propagating. It's too late for that. But the notion that it should be run on as many screens as possible and it should be propagated and observed as much as possible is completely negated by this question of how many of them are sitting at the bottom of the ocean. So there is a systemic critique being mounted here, I think. Or at least that's the implication, is that by virtue of running this thing, and we see later, by virtue of running, regardless of what your intentions are, so the point is intentionality doesn't particularly matter. Regardless of what your intentions are, this is the outcome. Worker degeneration. How many of these red balls are at the bottom of the ocean? And how many instances of the screensaver? It's not just one instance where all of these red balls are filling the ocean. It's many, many such cases, right? And they all end the same way. And that's pretty, look, people criticize Petscop and people criticize Domenico's work as being overly ambiguous, right? This is not ambiguous to me. This particular facet of the work is pretty clear and pretty unambiguous. this is a work of systemic horror, and the insinuation is that worker degeneration is a class condition. It is baked into the way the screensaver is designed. It is baked into the underlying worker concept. The system architecture. Um, and invariably, it leads to collapse because it treats the workers as things that can be discarded. They can be compressed and discarded into the ocean. And we have to ask ourselves at least like what is compression? Compression in terms of, um, in technological terms, compression is making a file smaller. Um, and what happens when you make a file smaller? For example, a photo. What happens when you make a photo smaller? What happens when you compress a photo? Um, there's an inherent loss of quality, right? And so I think the implication is twofold. We can talk about it in a general sort of system standpoint, from a system standpoint, and we can talk about it from a meta commentary standpoint. So, from a system standpoint, worker degeneration is essentially something akin to immiseration, the immiseration of the class of workers. So, I'm making, I'm extrapolating that thematic motif um, from the fact that we see these multicolored balls, right? And so this process known as worker degeneration is a class condition. So I'm making the leap and saying that yes, in object-oriented programming terms, these workers are instantiations of a class of objects, um, and that's how to understand it from a programming standpoint. But then, what are the thematic implications of that with respect to the work? Um, Class here being a stand-in for class in society, for the way class functions in society, for the way that oftentimes, due to the circumstances of your birth and the fact that you are uh, unlucky, you find yourself in the working class. And what happens? Your identity is to some degree compressed because you have to conform to these various conventions in order to in order to make a living for yourself and in order to survive in these coercive conditions. Um, and so you end up with a miseration because um, especially under conditions of when the system is in crisis, there's an inherent tendency for the capitalist, the owner class, to uh, try to increase the rate of exploitation. And what do I mean by that? I mean, in literal terms, if you're understanding this very literally, there is an incentive for the business owners to pay their employees less money and try to get them to do more work. So that would be one way to increase the rate of exploitation. And what are the consequences of that? The consequences are worker degeneration. We are compressed into inert masses, inert static masses that are devoid of any real depth or character per se, because because people living paycheck to paycheck and people who have to work minimum wage and can barely get by, they they don't really have autonomy in the sense that other people, in the sense that a middle class or a rich person does. They don't have time at the end of the day. They don't have the time or energy to pursue interests or to socialize with other people or to sort of realize their potential as a human in society. Um, and so this is, I think this is worth talking about, you know? Um, but that's how you that's how you can think of it from a system standpoint. When I say that this and Petscop are a sort of work of systemic horror, that's what I'm talking about. But there's this other angle too, which is that you can think of it also in terms of this red sphere of falseness that is alluded to earlier. Yes. Um, and I'm trying to think of exactly when it comes up. I'm not good with remembering these things, but um, I'm thinking about it in terms of meta commentary with respect to how something like a work like Petscop was received and how it um, what popular theories emerged to try to make sense of Petscop and how did people talk about it. Um, and I will say, I guess what I mean is, um, here we go. The red sphere of falseness. There it is. So this is thematically important. And I think what I'm getting at is that there's a sort of a flattening of the discourse, if you will, that attempts to make sense of something like Petscop. Um, and any kind of any kind of interpretation of it, however nuanced, is uh, inherently distortive in some way from from the creator's standpoint, if that makes sense. Um, because people are never going to fully get what you're going for. There's always, I guess I should explain this this particular type of alienation, because there's the alienation that Marx talks about, where you as a worker, you're alienated from the means of production because you don't own it. You're alienated from the product of your labor, right? Um, you're alienated in some sense from your fellow workers because you have to compete against them. You're alienated against the you're alienated from the owner, certainly, because you are put in a position where you have to sort of uh, their interests conflict with yours, right? Um, and with it at the grocery store, you're alienated from all of these other commodities. You don't really have a direct experience with respect to where exactly they came from or how they were produced. They appear to you as sort of uh, just commodities in the marketplace, right? So you don't necessarily understand the consequences how these things were produced. So there's all these different types of alienation that pertain to the specifically pertain to the capitalist mode of production. All these things I just mentioned, right? But then there's also a more general Hegelian alienation. What do I mean when I say that? The truth of the matter is, even if we resolved all of the problems with capitalism, even if we um, figured out how to overcome it, and from my perspective, achieve some kind of socialist utopia, that would be lovely, right? Um, we would overcome. We would have to figure out how to overcome these various forms of alienation that occur specifically to capitalism. Um, but we would not be able to overcome this more general Hegelian sense of alienation, which is inherent to reality itself. It's inherent to being a human subject in the world. Um, and there are various ways you can talk about this, and various directions you can go with it. But just to give you like an example, you're never going to fully um, whatever project you're working on in the world, whatever. Let's say you're working on a creative project. You're working on. Let's say you're a carpenter and you're creating a table. Um, because you cannot know the thing in itself. This is more of a Kantian idea, but because because we can never really fully understand reality um, in its full to its fullest extent to 100% fidelity, there's always going to be some discrepancy between whatever it is that you're working on and the product that emerges from that process. It's never going to turn out exactly how you want it to. There's always going to be something that you didn't account for, even if it's unknown to you. And oftentimes, the things that are unknown to you are the things that end up biting you in the ass later on, right? Um, there's this general form of alienation that is inescapable. There is also this sense in which your relationships with other people, you can know someone really quite well. Um, you can have close, intimate relationships with people. I'm not a pessimist in that respect. I'm not, um, you know, like I think that you know it is uh, it is possible to have a really healthy, good relationship with somebody. But the truth is, you're never really you're never really going to fully understand them. And that's both a tragedy, but that's what makes relationships kind of beautiful. Because even after knowing somebody for years and years and years, you never fully understand them, and it's always a process of learning more. And it's also a process of growing with that person, you know? And there are certainly cases where people grow apart, right? And that's sad, but it happens. But these are the types of alienation that are inherent to being a subject in the world. Um, and these are the things that would not be overcome, even if we resolved class contradictions and upended class society and created some kind of socialist utopia. right? We would still have these other problems. We would still not resolve these other forms of alienation. And so this is the duality of something like 3D Workers Island, because there is this systemic way that you can talk about it, but then there's also this meta commentary that's occurring with respect to how Petscop was received, and there is this implication that uh, even even the most nuanced perspectives get the red sphere of falseness, right? Um, or at least that's what I'm inferring based on how this is playing out and based on these various layers in the sort of uh, fractal relation, the sort of fractal pattern that emerges with respect to occurrences in the screensaver and subsequently occurrences in the forum and vice versa. Like there's an implication that perhaps things that are being said in the forum somehow influence um, things that are happening in the screensaver. After all, in the README file, what do we see? Very early on in the README file, we need to pay attention. Every single aspect of this story is important. So, um, like, workers are an approach to computation. 3D Workers Island takes advantage of resources in the world, right? And even and so there's this implication that things that are happening in the screensaver somehow these workers are taking advantage of resources in the world. And we have this recurring imagery where let me see if I can find it really quick. We have this recurring dichotomy between the world and the island, specifically the red building, right? And the red building is sort of like what's going on inside the red building is the thing in itself. The Kantian notion of noumena, the thing that we can never really fully understand. Um, and we can never really we never we can't see what's happening inside the red building. We can only project our own neuroses and kind of infer what's happening inside the red building. So I'm glad I did this. I'm putting some things together. I'm making some connections here that I think I wouldn't have uh, if I did not do this read through. So here we have the world, and here we have the red building, and here we have the world again, right? And so, what does that mean? You know, um, the software is somehow taking advantage of resources in the world. And so the implication is that somehow things that are being said in the forum influence things that are happening in the screensaver and vice versa, right? Because it's sort of like a feedback loop. Like um, people watch the screensaver, certain random occurrences happen. People discuss these random occurrences and project their own neuroses onto the screensaver. And then the screensaver responds by integrating some component of that neuroses into the dynamic interactions that are occurring, right? Um, and so it becomes a feedback loop between the screensaver, the software, these various instances that are running, and these discussions on the forum. And then later, the discussions that occur on this alternative bizarro website, 3DWI, right? So I don't know if are you thoroughly convinced that there is a hell of a lot going on here? I am. I think I could talk about this for another couple hours, but we're at an hour here, so I think I'll leave it there. This is the last you will hear from me with respect to any discussion of 3D Workers Island until I finish my analysis of the story. It is shaping up to be a truly behemoth project. I am completely overwhelmed, but I don't really, I don't really have any deadlines other than the ones I impose on myself. So I'm going to try to take my time. I want to do it right. I want to try to integrate visual components to the video that will make it clear, that will sort of help facilitate the kind of complex ideas that I'm talking about. Um, but you got a little taste of it here. I think you get a good impression of the various lenses through which I have analyzed the story. But yeah, I hope you found this useful, and let me know what you think. You know, um, I'm certainly open to other people's thoughts and theories as to what's going on. So take care. Have a good night.